Tonight, let your thoughts loosen their grip, like fingers opening in warm water. You don't have to solve anything. You don't have to become better, faster, brighter. You only have to be here, breathing, while the mind gently remembers how to soften. Somewhere far beyond the busy weather of your day, Jupiter drifts in the dark, an enormous, patient presence wrapped in bands of cloud, crowned with storms that have been turning for centuries. Around it, a small choir of moons keeps moving, not hurried, not lost. Each one following a path that has been repeated so many times, it has become a kind of lullaby written in gravity. And maybe that's what you need tonight, a rhythm that isn't yours to manage. Because it's normal to feel overfull, overstimulated, like your nervous system has been trying to carry too much light. The human brain is beautiful, yes, but it's also vigilant. It predicts, it prepares, it scans for what might go wrong, even when you're finally safe in bed. Somewhere deep in the mind, there's a small guardian who learned long ago that staying alert meant staying alive. So tonight, we won't argue with that part of you. We'll give it something else to hold. We'll take a slow, quiet journey to Jupiter's moons, worlds of fire and ice, oceans hidden under silence, ancient surfaces that remember every impact like a soft archive of time. And as we move from moon to moon, we'll let the facts arrive like falling snow, cool, gentle, unforced. A little neuroscience will be here too, not as a lecture, but as a lantern, a warm understanding of how awe steadies us, how rhythm calms us, how sleep is the brain's way of cleaning the day's dust from the corners. Let Jupiter be the heavy, comforting blanket of the cosmos. Let the moons be slow beads sliding on a string. And let your mind, just for a while, be allowed to drift. Tonight, you don't have to carry the world. If you've been holding your breath in small, invisible ways, through deadlines, messages, noises, worries, the tiny daily alarms that don't always ring out loud, then let this be a place where you can set some of it down. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a little. Let the muscles around your eyes soften. Let your jaw stop rehearsing its clench. Let your shoulders remember they are allowed to be heavy, allowed to be human, allowed to sink into whatever is supporting you. The bed, the pillow, the familiar gravity of Earth, quietly doing its job. Because gravity is one of the gentlest truths we live inside. It doesn't ask you to be impressive. It doesn't ask you to keep up. It simply holds. And tonight, we're going to travel slowly, like a feather drifting down through warm air, out past the restless glitter of the city lights, past the thin veil of atmosphere, past the moon that watches us like an old friend, and farther still. We're going to Jupiter, not the Jupiter of fear, or science fiction thunder, or dramatic storms in high contrast, but Jupiter as a symbol of steadiness, a vast, patient presence in the dark. A planet so large it almost feels like a principle rather than a place, like the universe saying, softly, some things are allowed to be big and calm at the same time. Imagine approaching it the way you might approach a sleeping animal you love, something enormous and safe, breathing slowly, not needing anything from you. Jupiter is wrapped in clouds that stretch around it in bands like brushed silk. Cream, tan, rust, pearl. Colors that feel like a palette meant for dreaming. And yes, there are storms. There is movement. There is weather that could swallow a world. But from far away, even the storms begin to look like patterns. Like the mind's own weather does. Once you stop standing directly inside it. From a distance, the great red spot, Jupiter's famous storm, becomes less of a threat and more of a reminder that something can spin and spin and spin, and still be part of a larger calm. That intensity can exist without becoming your whole sky. And around Jupiter, there are moons, many moons, more than you could easily count in the dim, quiet light of a bedtime story. But we're not going to rush ahead to names and numbers as if we're reciting a list to prove we were paying attention. Tonight isn't about proving anything. Tonight is about letting your mind rest against something steady. So let's begin with the simplest image. Jupiter, like a slow, heavy heart in the darkness, holding its moons the way a quiet heart holds feelings. Not gripping them, not trapping them, just keeping them near, the way gravity naturally does, by being itself. And as you imagine those moons moving in their repeating paths, notice what happens inside you when you think of repetition. For some people, repetition is terrifying, like being stuck in a loop. But for the nervous system, repetition can also be a kind of safety, a promise, a predictable curve returning again and again, saying, "You've been here before, you know what comes next." Nothing is suddenly chasing you. Orbit is the soft art of returning. A moon goes out into the dark and then comes back. It leans away and then leans in. It repeats. And somewhere deep inside your brain, there is a part of you that loves that. A part of you that is tired of surprises. Because the human brain, beautiful, stubborn, tender, is a prediction machine. It is always trying, quietly, to guess what will happen next. It watches faces for shifts. It listens for danger in footsteps. It scans your memories like old weather reports, trying to forecast whether tomorrow will bring sun or storm. That isn't you being dramatic. That's you being human. Somewhere deep in the mind, there is a watchtower, a lookout, a small devoted guardian who has kept you alive in a world that doesn't always feel gentle. And that guardian doesn't respond to logic as quickly as it responds to pattern. Not the pattern of "I should be calm," but the pattern of steady signals. A steady voice, a steady breath, a steady rhythm. The kind of rhythm you can trust because it doesn't suddenly turn sharp. This is one of the reasons bedtime rituals matter, not because you're doing sleep right, but because your nervous system learns through repetition. It learns that when the lights dim and the room quiets, and you move into the same familiar shape of rest, you are safe enough to power down. And that powering down is not a failure of productivity. It's an ancient intelligence. Because sleep is the brain's way of doing the soft maintenance work that can't happen when you're braced for the world. Sleep is when the inner watchtower can dim its lamps, when attention stops patrolling the horizon and starts returning inward. So tonight, let's give your brain something vast and predictable to rest on. Let's give it Jupiter's slow certainty. Imagine the journey closer. You drift through space without effort, as if you're being carried on a gentle current. There's no hurry here, no pressure to arrive. Even time feels different, stretched thin, like taffy warmed by a distant sun. Jupiter grows larger in your view, and with it a sense of weight, not a crushing weight, but the soothing kind, like a heavy blanket laid across restless shoulders. There is something comforting about mass, not because it dominates you, but because it doesn't need to prove itself. Jupiter doesn't need to rush. It doesn't need to justify being what it is. It simply exists, so massive that its gravity shapes the space around it, gathering moons, guiding their paths. And maybe that's what you need tonight. Permission to be shaped by something gentle, instead of trying to shape everything yourself. Because it's normal to feel like you've been managing too much. Normal to feel like you're the one who has to remember every detail, keep every promise, anticipate every mood, solve every problem before it becomes one. But you are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to be held. Let that sentence land slowly, the way snow settles on a quiet street. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to be held. If your mind wants to argue, that's okay. Minds do that. Minds are trained to keep the lights on. So we won't fight with the watchtower. We'll just give it another job. We'll say here, watch Jupiter, watch the moons. Let your attention become an astronomer, not a firefighter. And as you watch, notice how your breath naturally begins to slow, just a little, when you focus on something that doesn't demand anything back. Breath is one of the few bridges you can walk in both directions. You can't always think your way into calm. But you can sometimes breathe your way into it, not forcefully, not as a performance, just by lengthening the exhale the way you might lengthen the last note of a lullaby. In the body, exhale is often the signal that says, we can soften now. Inside your nervous system, there are currents that move like tides. One current prepares you for action, sharpens your senses, speeds your pulse, tightens your muscles, keeps the watchtower vigilant. Another current helps you rest and digest and repair, slows the heart, deepens the breath, invites the body back toward home. You don't have to memorize their names to feel them. But if you like gentle science, you can think of the resting current as your parasympathetic system, the part that turns down the volume on urgency, the part that helps the body believe in safety again. And it doesn't respond well to being shouted at. It responds to gentleness, to slow repetition, to warmth, to cues that say, nothing is chasing you. So as Jupiter fills your imagination, let the planet become a cue, a big, quiet cue. Let it be an enormous it's okay. Around Jupiter, the moons move with a kind of dignity. They don't jerk or scramble. They don't second-guess their path. They don't apologize for taking up space. They simply travel their arcs, again and again. Orbit is such a tender idea, if you let it be, because orbit is what happens when two truths meet, the desire to go forward and the desire to stay connected. A moon is always falling, in a sense, falling toward Jupiter, but also always moving forward, so it never quite lands. It becomes a dance between leaning in and moving on. And that's not so different from being a person. You lean into relationships. You lean into responsibilities. You lean into hopes and fears. And you also move forward, through days, through seasons, through versions of yourself you didn't plan. Sometimes you feel like you're falling. But sometimes falling is just another name for being held by something you can't see. Gravity is invisible, and still it is faithful. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't brag, it just continues. And maybe tonight you can borrow that feeling. The idea that there are invisible forces supporting you, habits, kindnesses, people who have loved you, small moments that didn't fix everything but kept you going. Even the bed beneath you is a kind of gravity in miniature, a steady pull that says, rest here. Now imagine the space around Jupiter, the region where its gravity is the dominant voice, where the rules become Jupiter's rules. In that space, moons find their lanes, they find their rhythms, they become part of the planet's slow song. And in your space, your bedroom, your night, there can be rules like that too. Not harsh rules, not rigid rules, but gentle ones. The rule that your phone can be far away. The rule that you don't have to answer anything tonight. The rule that whatever you didn't solve today can remain unsolved until morning. The rule that rest counts. Somewhere deep in the mind, the watchtower listens to rules like that, not because they're commands, but because they're boundaries. And boundaries are a kind of safety. As you continue to drift near Jupiter, You might notice how the planet's bands flow around it like slow rivers. Jupiter spins, everything in space is moving, and yet there's a sense of deep steadiness in its motion. This is another quiet comfort, the idea that movement does not always mean urgency. Your thoughts can move without needing to spiral. Your feelings can move without needing to flood. Sometimes the mind simply needs a large container. Jupiter can be that container tonight. If a thought arrives, something sharp, something unfinished, you don't have to grab it. You can place it gently in orbit. Let it circle at a distance. Let it be a moon. Because you are not obligated to solve every thought just because it appears. Thoughts are not always instructions. Some are just the brain testing the locks one more time before bed. So you can say, softly, "Thank you. Not tonight." And then return your attention to the slow repeating curve of the moons. This is what calming attention can feel like, not forcing silence, but choosing where you rest your gaze. And the gaze matters, because the brain is always taking cues from what you focus on. When you focus on threat, the body prepares. When you focus on steadiness, the body softens. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually, like a tide coming in. You might notice your forehead smoothing, your tongue resting more gently in your mouth, your hands opening a little, the ribs moving more freely. And you don't have to try to make those things happen. You just have to give your nervous system permission to notice. Nothing is required right now. As you imagine Jupiter and its moons, you're also doing something quietly powerful. You're inviting awe. Awe is like a pause in the brain's usual self-centered narration. It widens your inner room. It reminds you that your life, your worries, your tasks, your embarrassments are real, but not the whole universe. Awe doesn't erase pain, but it can loosen its grip. It can give the mind a wider horizon. The way stepping outside at night can make your problems feel a little less like walls and more like weather. And weather passes. Even on Jupiter, storms pass. Or rather, they change, they shift, they continue in their own strange time. And in you, emotions change too. Sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always moving. If tonight you are anxious, it's normal. If tonight you feel sad in a way you can't quite name, it's normal. If tonight your body feels tired but your mind feels awake, that's normal too. You are not doing anything wrong. You are simply arriving at the moment where the day ends and the nervous system finally has enough quiet to notice itself. So we meet that moment with gentleness. We don't demand sleep like it's a performance. We invite sleep like it's an animal that comes closer when you stop reaching for it. Let your breathing be simple, in and out. If it feels good, let the exhale be just a little longer than the inhale, like you're slowly letting air out of a balloon without making a sound. Let your body interpret that as a message of safety. Now, bring your attention back to Jupiter one more time. See the planet hanging in the black like a lantern made of cloud. See the moons tracing their paths like beads sliding on a string. See the repeating geometry of orbit, curves that return, curves that return, curves that return. And let your mind learn from that. Let your mind remember, not everything must be decided tonight. Some things can simply continue, predictably, while you rest. Your heart will keep beating. Your lungs will keep breathing. The world will keep turning. You don't have to supervise it. You don't have to be the gravity for everything. You can be the moon tonight, allowed to be held, allowed to circle, allowed to drift in a path that is steady because it does not depend on willpower. And if a part of you feels lonely or raw or like you've been carrying too much emotional weight, imagine Jupiter's gravity not as pressure, but as comfort. A deep, quiet presence saying, "I've got you. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that asks you to believe in anything you can't, but in the simplest physical way. Mass holds, rhythm steadies, patterns soothe. You are here, you are supported, and nothing is required of you except to rest. So let the watchtower dim its lights, one by one. Let the mind's horizon blur gently at the edges. Let Jupiter remain in the distance as a calm, unwavering symbol. A planet that does not rush. A planet that does not flinch. A planet that does not demand. And as you drift closer to sleep, you can carry one last thought with you, small enough to fit in your palm, warm enough to be kind. Like Jupiter holding its moons, you don't have to hold everything alone tonight. After Jupiter's wide steadiness, after that feeling of being held by something that doesn't hurry, we let our attention drift closer to one particular moon. Not the quiet, icy kind yet, not the moon that hides an ocean in its sleep. This one is different. This one glows. This one is a candle that never quite goes out. Its name is Ao, two soft vowels, like a breath you release without thinking. And in the dark around Jupiter, Io is the restless ember, the flicker, the place where the universe seems to admit, gently, that some worlds are made of motion. If you've ever tried to fall asleep while your mind stayed bright, ideas sparking, memories lighting up, worries turning over like coals, then Io is a kind of cosmic mirror. Not to shame you, not to diagnose you, only to say, you are not alone in your intensity. Some worlds burn, some brains do too, and burning in itself is not a moral failure. So come closer, slowly. We're not rushing toward heat, we're approaching it like you might approach a fireplace from across a quiet room, aware of the warmth, aware of the glow. Safe where you are. Io's surface is painted in strange, sleepy colors. Yellows and oranges, whites and reds, like someone spilled powdered spices across a black tablecloth. Those colors aren't just decoration. They come from sulfur and sulfur compounds, from frost and volcanic deposits laid down again and again, as if the moon is constantly rewriting itself. Io is one of the most volcanically active places we know in the solar system, with eruptions so powerful they can send plumes far above the surface. It is, quite literally, a world being remade in real time. And yet, held in Jupiter's gravity, it still belongs to a rhythm. Picture it, Io circling Jupiter on its repeated path, like a moth around a lantern, except this lantern is a planet. The orbit is steady, but inside Io something churns, something kneads and warms. Because the heat of Io doesn't come from sunlight in the usual way, it comes from gravity doing something intimate. Jupiter is so massive that it doesn't merely hold Io, it tugs on it. And not evenly, not gently the way a blanket rests on skin, but in a slow, persistent flexing. As Io moves around Jupiter on an orbit that isn't a perfect circle, the pull changes slightly from moment to moment. The moon stretches and relaxes, like a stress ball squeezed by an invisible hand. That repeated flexing creates friction deep inside, and friction becomes heat. It's called tidal heating. Tides, not of water, but of rock itself. Rock that behaves under enough pressure and time, like something that can bend. A world warmed from within by the shape of its path. A world kept hot by the way it returns. And there's something quietly poetic about that, isn't there? That returning can create warmth. That repetition can become a furnace. Because sometimes the mind does something similar. Sometimes it circles and circles a thought, and the circling creates heat, emotional heat, nervous heat, sleepless heat. Not because you're weak, not because you're too sensitive, but because the brain is trying to solve, trying to predict, trying to keep you safe, and it doesn't always know when the danger has passed. If tonight your thoughts are still awake, still bright, still busy in their own orbit, it's normal to feel frustrated. It's normal to wonder what's wrong with you. It's normal to think, why can't I just turn it off? But let's be kind to the part of you that won't turn off. Imagine it like Io's volcanoes. Pressure looking for a way to move. Energy looking for a pathway out. Hyperarousal, when the nervous system stays revved, even in bed, often comes from learning to stay ready. Ready for the next email, the next conflict, the next task, the next disappointment, the next unpredictable moment. The body doesn't always understand calendars. It understands signals. And if your life has taught your nervous system that ready is safer than relaxed, then it will burn bright, not because it wants to ruin your night, because it loves you in the only way it learned. So tonight, we don't try to extinguish the fire. We just step back far enough to watch it without being burned. That's an important kind of safety, distance. The way you can watch lightning from a window and feel awe instead of fear. Because you're not out in the storm. The way you can watch waves crash from the shore and feel steadied rather than swallowed. So let Io's fire be out there, far away, while you rest here. You might imagine the volcanoes as tiny, luminous punctuation marks on a dark sphere. Some are broad, like slow-breathing furnaces. Some are sudden, some are constant. Lakes of lava, currents of molten rock, plumes that rise and fall like exhalations. And here's another tender truth. Io's volcanism is not random chaos. It's the expression of a system in balance, an exchange between gravitational pull and orbital motion, between flexing and release. Io's heat is the cost of being held so closely by something so massive. And the oddness of its orbit is maintained, in part by a gravitational relationship with neighboring moons, Europa and Ganymede, like three dancers keeping time with each other so the steps don't settle into stillness too soon. Even the restlessness has a structure. Even the fire has a pattern. You might let that thought settle in you. Because if your mind is restless, it might not be meaningless. It might be patterned. It might be a response. A learned rhythm. A nervous system that got good at staying bright because brightness once meant survival. And now, in the quiet, the system hasn't yet received the message that it can dim. So we deliver the message softly, not by arguing, not by demanding, not by forcing sleep like a door, but by offering steady cues, a slower breath, a heavier body, a gentler inner voice. If it helps, you can take a moment to notice the weight of your own limbs, arms, legs, like they're warming into the mattress. There's no need to move them. Let them be moons. Let them be held. And if a thought flares up, an image, a sentence, a worry, see if you can treat it like a distant eruption. Oh, you might think, calmly, there's heat. Not there's something wrong, just there's heat. That small shift matters. Because the brain isn't only a storyteller, it's also an energy manager. All day long it budgets attention, spends focus, burns glucose, turns sensations into meaning. When you're under stress, that budget gets strained. The body releases chemicals that support alertness. The mind narrows toward threats. The imagination rehearses what could happen next. This is useful when something truly needs solving. But at night, it can become a loop. The brain keeps spending energy to prepare for a future that isn't arriving in the bedroom. And in many people, insomnia isn't simply not being sleepy. It's being too awake, too vigilant, like a city that won't turn off its lights. Researchers often describe insomnia through this lens of hyperarousal. The nervous system remains activated in a way that makes rest difficult. It's not a character flaw. It's physiology shaped by experience. It's a body trying earnestly to protect you. So when you can't sleep, you don't need more shame. You need more safety, and you deserve it. Et al., 2010. Bonnet and Durand, 2010. Now, let's float back to I.O. again, because science, when it's offered gently, can become its own kind of safety. There's comfort in learning that the universe contains places where energy must go somewhere. Places where the pressure doesn't mean catastrophe, it means expression. Io's surface is marked by volcanic calderas and flows. The moon has been observed by spacecraft that saw enormous plumes and a landscape that seems young because it is constantly resurfaced by eruptions. In a quiet way, Io is a reminder that even rock can be dynamic, and that change is not always a sign of instability. It can be a sign of a system staying alive. Io overview. Even Io's thin atmosphere is tied to its volcanism, mostly sulfur dioxide, waxing and waning, fed by the moon's constant outgassing. In the space around Jupiter, some of that material becomes part of a larger environment. Ions and plasma interacting with Jupiter's magnetic field in a vast, invisible choreography. Io is not only burning, it is participating. It is contributing to a system bigger than itself. Io overview. And you too are part of systems. Breath, blood, nerves, memory, attachment, habit. The ancient mammalian need to belong. Sometimes restlessness is a sign not that you are broken, but that you are connected to responsibilities, to people, to expectations, to the pressure of being perceived, to the quiet fear of letting someone down. It's normal to feel too much when you've been carrying too much. So let's reframe it, like turning a gemstone in the light. Instead of, I'm too much, try I'm full of energy. Instead of, I can't stop thinking. Try my brain is trying to protect me. Instead of, I'm failing at sleep. Try my nervous system needs gentleness. None of these sentences are magic spells. They won't instantly turn off the volcanoes. But they change the atmosphere. They change the tone of the inner room. And tone matters. Because the brain listens not only to words, but to how you say them, your internal voice, as a kind of weather. If your internal voice is harsh, the watchtower stays alert, danger is still here. If your internal voice is kind, the watchtower considers, maybe we are safe. So speak to yourself like you would speak to someone you love who is exhausted. Softly, patiently, without the hidden threat of disappointment. Now, imagine you are watching Io from a great distance, like a quiet observer on a ship gliding through space. The moon is small in the window, a glowing bead. And on that bead, you see a flicker, an eruption, brief and bright. You don't need to stop it. You don't need to analyze it. You can simply notice it and let it pass. That's the practice tonight, witnessing without climbing into the fire. You might even imagine placing each thought into its own orbit. A thought about tomorrow. Put it in orbit. A thought about something you said. Put it in orbit. A thought about money, or health, or love. Put it in orbit. Let Jupiter's gravity, this symbol of steadiness, hold them all at a distance, so you don't have to hold them inside your chest. And if a feeling rises, sadness, anger, longing, imagine it as geothermal pressure finding a vent. Not to explode, just to release. Feelings, too, are a kind of energy. They want motion, they want expression, they want a pathway. Sometimes the pathway is crying, sometimes it's a sigh, sometimes it's a subtle unclenching. you didn't realize you were maintaining. So if your eyes prick with tears, it's okay. If your chest feels tight, it's okay. If your stomach shifts, it's okay. This is not you doing something wrong. This is your inner world moving, like Io's landscape moving, releasing and rearranging so that something new can settle. And gradually, as you continue to watch from your safe distance, you may notice that the eruptions don't feel quite as personal. They're not indictments. They're not emergencies. They're events. A flare, a plume, a wave of heat, and then the dark again. And perhaps your breath is a little slower now, without you forcing it. Perhaps your tongue rests more easily. Perhaps the muscles between your eyebrows begin to smooth, as if the face is finally allowed to stop translating the day. If not, that's okay too. Some nights the nervous system needs more time. Some nights it takes longer for the body to believe the message. You don't have to rush it. You don't have to threaten yourself with tomorrow. You are allowed to be where you are. And in the meantime, you can keep watching Io, this candle that never goes out, until its glow becomes less like alarm and more like comfort. Because a candle, after all, is not only a fire, it's also a light in the dark. And sometimes what keeps us awake is not only fear, but the longing to be seen, the longing for clarity, the longing for a sign. So let Io be a sign of this. That intensity can be natural, that heat can have a cause, that restlessness can be understood. And when something is understood, it softens. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer has to fight to be acknowledged. Now, the ship of your attention begins to drift outward again, away from Io's warmth. Not because we reject it, not because we're done with it, but because the story has other textures ahead. Ice, silence, hidden water, deeper quiet. As Io grows smaller in the distance, keep the lesson it offered you. You do not have to hate your fire to find your rest. You can let it burn safely, far away. You can be the observer, not the volcano. And in that gentle distance, sleep has more room to approach, like an animal stepping out of the trees when the clearing finally goes still. So, we leave Io glowing behind us, a tiny ember on the edge of the dark. And ahead, like a pale coin half buried in night, Europa waits. A surface of ice, a hush, a secret ocean beneath silence. And the promise that stillness, too, can hold something living. We leave Io behind us like a small ember floating in the dark. It keeps glowing, because some worlds do, because some minds do, and because learning not to fear your inner fire is one of the quiet kindnesses you can offer yourself. Now the warmth fades into distance. The space around you cools, not in a sharp way, but in the gentle way a room cools when you finally turn off the day's lamps. The darkness feels wider, softer, less demanding, and ahead, pale as a pearl in moonlight, Europa waits. Europa doesn't announce itself with flame. Europa doesn't throw sparks. Europa is quiet enough to mistake for emptiness, until you come closer and realize the silence has texture. Its surface is bright, almost luminous, ice reflecting thin sunlight, as if it's been polished by time. And across that brightness run long, delicate lines, cracks and streaks, crisscrossing like fine ink on a sheet of paper. It looks, from far away, like a world that has been gently written on. Not carved, not broken, written. These lines, these wandering, overlapping scars, aren't the jagged wounds of violence. They feel more like the marks of movement beneath a surface that would otherwise seem still, like a frozen lake that has shifted quietly in the night. like the thin creases that form at the corner of someone's eyes after years of smiling and squinting into sun. Europa is the dream of hidden tenderness, a calm face, and beneath it, a living depth. And if you've ever been the person who looked fine while so much moved beneath you, if you've ever carried an ocean under your own calm surface, then Europa may feel strangely familiar. Because some of the most real things do not shout. Some things move under ice. As we drift nearer, notice how your own body responds to this image of stillness. Often, when we finally stop moving, when the day's tasks are done and the room goes quiet, our inner world seems to get louder. Not because something is wrong, because you can finally hear it. All day, your senses are pulled outward. Screens, voices, traffic, conversations, responsibilities. Your attention is constantly recruited. Even your thoughts are often shaped by external demands. What needs answering, what needs fixing, what needs proving. But at night, when the external world dims, the brain does something tender and inevitable. It turns inward. And suddenly you notice the small things, the pulse in your wrist, the tightness across your chest, the heaviness in your stomach, the ache you ignored at noon, the feeling you swallowed at 3 o'clock and promised you'd deal with later. Later is now. And it's normal. Somewhere deep in the mind, there is a sense that nighttime is the only safe time to feel what was postponed. Like a tide that waits for the right hour to rise, emotion often arrives when you're finally still enough to receive it. Europa teaches us that stillness is not the absence of life. Stillness can be a shell, and under the shell, movement. Under the shell, water. Under the shell, something immense. Scientists have long suspected and continue to gather evidence that beneath Europa's ice there is a global ocean, salt water, dark, cold, and vast. Not a little hidden lake, but a world of water wrapped in ice, like a secret kept safe. And what makes this especially gentle, especially wondrous, is that Europa's ocean may be touching rock beneath it, possibly interacting with a seafloor, exchanging minerals and chemistry the way Earth's oceans do with Earth's crust. In the language of science, this matters for habitability. In the language of bedtime, it matters because it means, even here, under silence, the ingredients for aliveness may be quietly present. Europa Overview, NASA Europa Clipper. You don't have to be interested in extraterrestrial life to feel the comfort of that idea, that something can be hidden and still be real, that something can be covered and still be there, that something can be quiet and still be deep. Europa's surface is cold, yes, but it isn't dead in the way we might imagine. The cracks and streaks suggest the ice has moved, shifted, perhaps opened and refrozen. Some regions, often called chaos terrain, look as though plates of ice have broken, rotated and drifted, like shattered glass that somehow rearranged itself. Not violent, exactly, more like slow upheaval, patient and geological. Europa Overview. And beneath that ice, the ocean is thought to persist because Europa, like Io, is flexed by gravity. Not heated into fire, but warmed enough inside to keep water from freezing solid. Tidal forces, the steady kneading of Jupiter's pull and the moon's orbital interactions, may generate internal heat. Not a blaze, a pulse, a quiet warmth, like the body temperature that keeps you alive through winter. Europa Overview. Now let Europa become a metaphor, but a careful one. A metaphor that doesn't cheapen the science and doesn't cheapen your experience. Let Europa's ice be the composed face you show the world. And let Europa's ocean be what you actually carry. Feelings, needs, memories, longing, grief, love. So many people move through life with a kind of practiced ice, not because they are cold, because they learned that being readable wasn't safe. They learned that tears caused problems, that anger caused consequences, that asking for help caused disappointment. So they became smooth, bright, presentable, and underneath, the ocean kept moving. If that's you, even a little, if you've learned to keep the surface neat, then night can feel like a threat. Because night is when you're no longer performing. Night is when the ocean taps at the underside of the ice. Not to punish you, to be acknowledged. In neuroscience, there's a word for the sense of what's happening inside your body. Interoception. It's the mind's ability to notice internal signals, heartbeat, breath, hunger, fullness, warmth, tension, the subtle chemistry of emotion as it becomes sensation. Like a weather report from within. Hall et al. 2018. Interoception is often quiet during the day because the brain is busy prioritizing the outside world. But in the stillness of bed, the volume changes. The outside is dim. The inside is closer. And sometimes, if you're anxious, those internal signals can feel loud and ambiguous. A flutter in the chest becomes, what if something is wrong? A tight throat becomes, why am I like this? A sinking stomach becomes, I can't handle tomorrow. But what if tonight we treat those sensations like Europa's ocean? Not emergencies, not moral failures, just movement, just tides. Your heart is allowed to beat. Your lungs are allowed to ask for slower air. Your stomach is allowed to hold what it holds. And your feelings, whatever they are allowed to exist beneath the surface without you needing to fix them immediately. Somewhere deep in the mind, there is a part of you that believes, if I feel it, it will drown me. But feelings are more like oceans than floods. They have rhythms. They rise, they fall, they move through. And one of the gentlest skills you can practice, without effort, without perfection, is simply noticing. Noticing in the nervous system can be like opening a small vent. Pressure doesn't have to explode when it's allowed to breathe. So you might try this very softly. Notice where your body touches the bed. Notice the weight of your legs. Notice the curve of your back. Notice the air moving in and out. And if you notice a feeling, sadness, fear, loneliness, see if you can locate where it lives in the body right now. Not as a test, as a kindness. Maybe sadness is heaviness behind the eyes. Maybe anxiety is a restless fizz in the chest. Maybe loneliness is a hollow ache under the ribs. You don't have to name it perfectly. You don't have to interpret it. You don't have to turn it into a story. Just notice it the way you would notice moonlight on a floor. And then, like watching a distant ocean under ice, let it be there. This is not giving up. This is letting the nervous system learn a new association that feeling is survivable. That sensation is not the same thing as danger. That the ocean can move without breaking the world. Europa helps us imagine that kind of containment. A strong shell that doesn't need to be rigid, just steady. Ice that floats. Ice that can crack and still remain. And sometimes, the most comforting thought is this. Even if there are cracks in you, you are still held. Now, drift your imagination back over Europa's surface. Those long lines, those pale streaks, may be places where the ice has been pulled apart and stained by material from below, or altered by chemistry, or reshaped by time. They speak of motion that doesn't need to be dramatic to be real. Europa overview. And there's another bedtime wonder detail. Scientists have observed evidence that Europa may sometimes send water vapor into space, possible plumes that rise like brief exhalations. These observations are challenging and not always consistent. but the idea itself is profoundly soothing, a hidden ocean that occasionally breathes. Tal, 2014, NASA Europa Clipper. Just imagine it, a world that seems silent, releasing a soft, temporary mist into the dark, like your own body releasing a sigh you didn't know you were holding, like your own heart letting go of a small amount of pressure when you finally stop pretending you're fine. You don't need to force a breakthrough tonight. This isn't a story about shattering ice. It's a story about letting the surface float. Because forcing can backfire. The nervous system doesn't like to be pried open. It responds to safety, to slow invitation, to patience. So if something rises in you, some memory, some grief, some unresolved tenderness, you can meet it as if you are Europa itself, with steadiness, with containment, with the quiet knowledge that depth is not the enemy. And here's another gentle fact. Evidence for Europa's ocean isn't based only on wishful thinking. One of the strongest lines of evidence comes from how Europa interacts with Jupiter's magnetic environment. Measurements from spacecraft have been consistent with the idea that Europa has a conducting layer beneath its ice, likely a salty ocean, that responds to Jupiter's changing magnetic field, producing an induced magnetic signature. In softer words, the Moon behaves as if it has water inside. Yvel et al., 2000, NASA Europa Overview. It's such a tender kind of proof, not a photograph of the ocean. A hint, a response, an echo. Sometimes, in our own lives, we also know what's inside us not because we can see it clearly, but because we can feel its influence. You know you're grieving because music sounds different. You know you're stressed because your shoulders don't drop. You know you're lonely because your phone feels heavier. You know there is an ocean because it changes the field around you. And that doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're alive and responding. So tonight, if you can't sleep quickly, you can treat it not as a failure, but as information. Your inner ocean wants attention. Even a small amount. Even 5 quiet breaths of noticing. You might place a hand gently on your chest or abdomen, only if it feels soothing. And let that touch be your ice shell, a boundary that says, I'm here, I can hold this. The brain is deeply influenced by embodied cues. Gentle touch, slow breathing, and soft attention can signal safety through pathways that connect body and brain. Interoceptive awareness, simply noticing internal sensations without panic, can, over time, change how threatening those sensations feel. Again, no forcing tonight, just a little practice in being with what is. Hall et al., 2018. And as you do, let Europa's image continue to soothe you. A bright moon, a quiet shell, a deep ocean under silence. If you've spent years thinking you're too sensitive, consider this. Sensitivity is often just closeness to your own inner signals. It can be overwhelming in a world that moves too fast. But in a slower world, in a bedtime world, sensitivity can become wisdom. Because the body is always telling the truth. Not always the truth your mind is afraid of. Often the truth you've been too busy to hear. You might notice your breathing now, how it naturally wants to slow when your attention is gentle. You might notice a small release in your throat or shoulders. Or you might notice nothing at all. Either way is fine. Europa doesn't demand that you see the ocean. Europa simply invites you to trust that depth can exist without drama. And slowly, that trust can become a kind of rest. Now, we begin to drift onward, as if carried by a current you don't have to control. Europa slips behind us, still shining, still quiet, still holding its secret water. Take with you what it offered, that you can look calm on the outside and still have a whole inner world moving beneath you, and that this is not a contradiction. It's not a weakness. It's a human truth that when you finally stop moving, your feelings may rise, not to harm you, but to be acknowledged. That you do not need to break open to heal. You can soften. You can float. You can let the surface be steady while the ocean moves below. And ahead, another moon begins to appear, larger, darker, dignified. Ganymede. A moon with its own strange, invisible compass, a quiet lesson about boundaries and direction and finding your inner north. But for now, stay with the hush Europa left in the room. Stay with the idea that deep things can be safe. And let that safety carry you closer to sleep. Europa fades behind us like a pale thought you don't need to chase. The hush it leaves is not emptiness. It's the kind of quiet that has depth, like standing in a hallway at night and realizing the house is still alive, just resting. Somewhere, pipes hold water. Somewhere, wood cools and settles. Somewhere, the air keeps moving in slow, invisible loops. We drift onward through Jupiter's dark domain, and the next moon begins to take shape. At first, it's only a curve, shadowed, round, patient. Then it becomes a world with weight, a presence. Ganymede. Even the name feels steady, like a stone warmed by the sun and carried in a pocket. Ganymede is the largest moon in our solar system, larger even than Mercury, and yet it moves around Jupiter with the quiet modesty of a companion who doesn't need to be impressive to be real. And tonight, we don't come to Ganymede for drama. We come for orientation, because there are nights, maybe you know them well, when you feel turned around inside yourself. When anxiety makes every direction feel like the wrong one. When burnout makes even simple choices feel heavy. When other people's needs, alarms and urgencies tug at you from every angle until you can't tell what you actually want, what you actually feel, what you actually need. It can feel like losing your internal north, like walking through a dim hallway without a hand on the wall. So let Ganymede appear as a guide, a moon with its own compass. A quiet reminder that even in the enormous pull of something bigger, Jupiter's gravity, life's demands, the social field of expectations, there can still be an inner signal that belongs to you. Because Ganymede has something rare. It has its own intrinsic magnetic field, the only moon we know of that does. Not just a field induced by an ocean responding to its planet's magnetism, but a magnetic field generated from within, like a private lantern of direction. Ganymede Overview, Galileo mission findings summarized by NASA JPL. Imagine that for a moment, an invisible armor that isn't aggressive, not spiked, not hard, more like a soft shell of orientation, a field you can't see, but that shapes what comes close and how it moves. A boundary made of quiet physics. If you've spent your life learning to be permeable, absorbing moods, anticipating needs, translating everyone else's weather, then you may not have had many chances to imagine boundaries as something gentle and natural. But boundaries can be like magnetic fields. They don't need to be loud to be real. They don't need to be cruel to be effective. They simply define space. This is yours. That is not yours. And as you settle into bed tonight, you can let this story be a place where you practice that kind of gentle definition, not as a confrontation with the world, as a return to yourself. Ganymede, seen up close, is not a smooth pearl like Europa. It has a surface with two moods, darker, older regions, and lighter, younger-looking terrain marked by grooves and ridges, as if time has dragged a comb through ice and rock. Overview. It's a moon with history written plainly, not hidden under one immaculate shell, but layered, like a person who has lived through seasons and carries both the earlier chapters and the later ones. And beneath that surface, Ganymede may also hold oceans, possibly multiple layers of salty water separated by different phases of ice, deep inside. The details are complex and still being refined, but NASA's overview of Ganymede notes strong evidence it contains a subsurface ocean. So Ganymede is not only a compass, it is also, like Europa, a world with depth. But tonight we'll let the depth be secondary, the way your deeper feelings can be held quietly in the background while you focus on one simple thing: finding your direction. In the human brain, direction is not just a metaphor, it's a living function. Somewhere deep inside your head, there are networks that help you locate yourself in space and time. Systems that build inner maps, track landmarks, remember safe routes, and notice when something feels unfamiliar. A key structure involved in memory and navigation is the hippocampus. Scientists discovered place cells in the hippocampus, neurons that become active when an animal is in a particular location, suggesting the brain builds internal representations of space. Later work also identified grid cells in the entorhinal cortex that fire in a spatial grid-like pattern, supporting navigation and mapping. Keefe and Ostrovsky, 1971. Moser et al., 2008. You don't need the vocabulary, just the image, an inner map maker, a quiet cartographer who lives in you, drawing pathways through experience. When life is calm, this mapmaker does its work softly. You move through your days with a sense of where you are, emotionally and practically, even if things are complicated. You know which choices feel aligned. You know where home is, at least as a direction. But when you're stressed, that inner map can feel scrambled. Stress changes attention. It narrows your field of view. It makes the brain prioritize immediate threats and urgent tasks. And over time, chronic stress can affect memory and hippocampal function in ways that have been documented across many studies. The details vary by individual and situation, but the general pattern is well known. Prolonged stress can make it harder to think flexibly, remember clearly, and feel oriented. Yoon, 2007. This is why burnout can feel like being lost even in familiar places. Not lost on the street, lost in yourself. And if that's you tonight, it helps to know this isn't laziness, this isn't stupidity, this isn't a personal defect. It's a nervous system that has been asked to do too much for too long. So we won't shame the lostness, we'll treat it like fog. Fog is not a failure of the landscape. Fog is just a condition. And in fog, you don't sprint, you slow down. You put a hand out. You find the wall. You take small steps and trust that the hallway still leads somewhere. Let Ganymede be that hallway wall tonight, that steady contact. Because a compass doesn't argue with the weather, it simply points. And what's so soothing about Ganymede's magnetic field is that it exists regardless of whether anyone is watching. It's intrinsic, internal. It doesn't need approval. There's a tender lesson there. Your inner direction doesn't have to be earned. It can be inherent. Not a perfect purpose, not a grand identity, just a quiet sense of what is yours, your values, your limits, your need for rest, your right to say no, your right to be unfinished. Now imagine Ganymede's magnetic field as a soft sphere around the Moon, interacting with Jupiter's much larger magnetic environment. Ganymede actually has a small magnetosphere of its own, an envelope within Jupiter's bigger field, creating a nested system of invisible forces. Overview. That's such a helpful image for a human life, because you too live inside bigger fields, family systems, work cultures, news cycles, social expectations, the subtle pressures of being observed. Those fields are powerful. They can shape you without permission. But inside them, you can still have your own field, your own no, your own not today, your own this matters to me, your own I need quiet. And here in bed, you can practice feeling that, not as a fight, as a calibration. In the body, calibration often begins with noticing. Notice your breathing again, not to control it tightly, but to let it become a landmark. In and out. Breath is like a little North Star. It's always there, even if your thoughts wander. If your mind is busy tonight, that's okay. Let it be busy. You can still orient to breath the way a traveler orients to a single visible light in the distance. And if you notice tension in your body, you can treat it like a compass needle that's been jostled. No need to punish it. Just give it time to settle. Sometimes the most boundary-making thing you can do is soften. Because softness is a signal. Softness tells the nervous system we are not bracing for impact. And bracing is exhausting. So let your face loosen. Let your tongue rest. Let your shoulders drop a fraction. If you can, imagine your body surrounded by a gentle field. Not a wall, but a boundary of kindness. Inside this field, you don't have to solve other people's feelings. Inside this field, you don't have to rehearse tomorrow. Inside this field, you don't have to be available. You can rest. And rest is not a break from life. Rest is part of life's navigation. Because sleep is when the brain reorganizes, when it integrates memories, tunes emotional responses, and restores the capacity to orient again. You don't need to force sleep by effort. But it can help to remember, sleep is not something you earn. It's something your brain does for you when it finally receives enough cues of safety and permission. And born. 2013. Ganymede's lesson is permission. A moon with its own compass doesn't apologize for having direction. It simply turns, and the field turns with it, quietly insisting, I exist from within. Now, let's look at Ganymede one more time, as if you're floating above its surface. The moon is cold, but not sterile. The light is dim, but not empty. The terrain holds grooves like long, slow brushstrokes, and somewhere above it, auroras can glow near the poles. Faint curtains of light shaped by magnetic fields and charged particles. Ganymede's auroral behavior has even been used to infer properties of its interior ocean, because conductive layers can affect how the magnetic environment interacts with the moon. Ganymede Overview, Saw et al., 2015. There's something deeply bedtime-friendly about auroras. They're proof that invisible fields can become visible, briefly, as light. Like feelings that finally show themselves in a quiet room, like the way your inner world might glow in a small way when you stop pushing it down. So if you feel a gentle wave of emotion now, soft sadness, soft relief, let it be an aurora, not a crisis, a glow. A sign that something inside you is responding to attention. Now we bring the metaphor back home, into the dim hallway of your own night. Imagine you're walking slowly, barefoot, down a corridor inside yourself. The lights are low, you can't see everything, but you can feel the wall with your fingertips. You can feel the floor under your feet. You can feel your own presence, steady enough, real enough. Each breath is a step, in, step, out, step. And as you walk, you pass doors you don't have to open tonight. The door of tomorrow's tasks, the door of old arguments, the door of self-judgment, the door of what if. You can leave them closed. You are not avoiding your life. You are pacing yourself. And pacing yourself is a boundary. Somewhere deep in the mind, the anxious part of you may still be scanning. That's okay. It learned to scan for reasons. But now you're giving it something else. A direction that is not built on urgency. A direction built on care. If you want a simple phrase to carry like a compass point, let it be this. What is mine to hold tonight, and what can wait? You don't have to answer perfectly. The question itself is a boundary. The question itself is a field. And often, the answer is very small. Tonight, you hold your breath. Tonight, you hold your body. Tonight, you hold nothing else. Everything else can orbit. Just as Ganymede orbits inside Jupiter's enormous gravitational world, you orbit inside the larger structures of your life. But you are allowed to have your own internal signal, your own magnetic field of values and limits. You are allowed to recalibrate. You are allowed to rest without explaining it. Let that land gently, because many people, especially the thoughtful, the sensitive, the responsible, treat rest like a debt they must justify. They rest with one eye open, already spending tomorrow's energy. But Ganymede doesn't apologize for needing its orbit. It doesn't apologize for having a field. And neither do you have to apologize for needing sleep. As the story begins to drift onward again, Ganymede remains behind us like a steady point in the dark, quietly extraordinary, quietly self-contained. Take with you what it offered. That boundaries can be gentle, that direction can be internal, that you can be inside something larger and still belong to yourself. And now, as your breathing continues its slow, unhurried rhythm, we begin moving toward the next moon, Callisto, older, darker, cratered like an ancient library of time, a place that will teach us another kind of rest, not the rest of direction, but the rest of memory, the rest of letting the day be filed away page by page while you sleep. I'm going to treat your paced prompt as the next chapter in our journey, Callisto, so we can keep drifting forward without breaking the spell. After Ganymede's quiet compass, after the comfort of imagining an inner field that belongs to you, we continue outward through Jupiter's moonlit neighborhood. The light grows thinner here, not darker in a frightening way, just softer, as if the universe is turning down the brightness, so your mind can do the same. And then Callisto appears. Callisto is not a shining shell like Europa, not a glowing ember like Io, not a moon with a visible sense of newness. Callisto looks old, and somehow that's comforting. It is dark, muted, like a stone that has been sitting in a riverbed for a very long time, letting the current pass over it until it learned the art of not resisting. Its surface is covered in craters, so many that it can feel, at first glance, like a memory of impact itself, a world that has been written on by time in the language of circles. Crater after crater after crater, not as a punishment, as a record. Callisto is one of the most heavily cratered bodies in our solar system, and its surface is thought to be extremely ancient, old enough to preserve a long history of collisions that other, more geologically active worlds might erase. It hasn't been resurfaced over and over by volcanoes like Io. It hasn't been rewritten as dramatically by internal motion like some other moons. It's more like an archive, quietly holding what happened. Callisto overview. And tonight, that's exactly what we need. An archive. Because the mind is an archive too. And if you're lying here with thoughts that feel like scattered papers, unfinished tasks, half-solved conversations, old scenes replaying with new dialogue, it can help to remember your brain has a night shift. A team of gentle librarians that comes out when the lights are low. Sleep is not only rest, It's organization, not the harsh, fluorescent kind of organizing where you judge yourself for the mess, but the softer kind, where the mind sorts what matters, files what can be stored, and lets some things fade so you don't have to carry every detail at full intensity. So let Callisto become the setting for that kind of work. Imagine drifting closer until you can see the surface in more detail. The craters overlap like old footprints in snow that never melted, layered evidence that time has been walking here for eons. Some craters are sharp-rimmed. Some are softened, like words smudged on an ancient page. There are bright rings and pale scars, and dark plains between them. Quiet stretches where nothing dramatic seems to happen. And yet everything is remembered. Callisto doesn't rush to heal its surface. It doesn't try to become new. It simply remains. And there is a deep bedtime lesson in that. You don't have to reinvent yourself to be worthy of rest. You don't have to erase your past to deserve peace. You don't have to pretend nothing ever hit you. Because you are allowed to have craters. You are allowed to have marks. You are allowed to have places where life landed hard. So many people carry a secret belief that healing means becoming smooth, becoming spotless, becoming someone who never flinches when the old story approaches. But Callisto teaches another possibility. Healing can also mean becoming stable enough to hold your history without constantly reliving it. A library doesn't burn old books to become pure. It shelves them. It keeps them somewhere safe. And sleep, true sleep, deep sleep, is one of the ways the brain learns to shelve. In the science of sleep, memory consolidation is one of the most enduring themes. During sleep, the brain replays and reorganizes information, helping move some memories from a fragile, fresh state into more stable, long-term storage. It's not as simple as sleep saves everything, and it's not the same every night. But overall, sleep supports learning and memory in ways we can measure. Unborn, 2013. Now, let's hold that gently, like a warm cup in both hands. Because we're not here to lecture about stages and mechanisms like a classroom. We're here to let the idea soothe you, that your brain knows how to file the day. You don't have to do it manually at midnight with your anxious mind. If your thoughts keep trying to sort, you can whisper back, softly, kindly, "Thank you." The librarians will handle it and then return to the image of Callisto, this moon that has been holding records longer than we can easily imagine. Callisto's distance from Jupiter matters here too. It orbits farther out than the inner Galilean moons, and because of that, it experiences less tidal heating than moons like Io, less kneading, less internal urgency. It's a quieter place, geologically speaking, less constantly remade by the push and pull of Jupiter's gravity. Callisto overview. And that quiet becomes a metaphor you can rest in. Not every part of you has to be in motion. Not every night has to be a breakthrough. Some nights, the most profound healing is simply staying still long enough for the nervous system to realize it can. If your body is tired but your mind keeps checking, that's normal. Somewhere deep in the mind, the watchtower still exists. But the watchtower learns over time that not every quiet moment is the beginning of danger. Sometimes, quiet is just quiet. So let's practice the Callisto kind of quiet. If it helps, you can imagine your bed as a wide, dark plane on Callisto's surface. Cool, steady, unjudging. And you are lying there like a small traveler who has finally found a safe place to stop. Your breath becomes a slow footstep, in and out. And with each exhale, imagine setting one more mental paper onto a shelf. Not shredding it, not solving it, just shelving it. That's a boundary too, like anime taught us, but softer. More like a gentle hand closing a book for the night. Now there's another layer of sleep science that can feel especially comforting in a bedtime story. The idea that sleep doesn't only help with memories, it helps with emotional tone. When we're tired, emotions often feel louder and sharper. The brain's alarm systems become more reactive. Patience runs thin. Worries feel more convincing. Sleep helps recalibrate that. It can reduce the intensity of emotional responses and support a more balanced perspective the next day. Again, not magically, not always, but often enough that we can feel the difference. Walker and van der Helm, 2009. So, if you're lying here replaying something painful, an awkward moment, a conflict, a regret, consider this. You don't have to finish the replay tonight. Your brain can revisit it with fresh resources tomorrow, after the night shift has done some quiet work. Callisto's craters remind us that impact does not need to stay fresh. Time can soften edges. Sleep can soften edges. And you deserve softened edges. Now, drift your attention over the surface again. One of Callisto's most famous features is a large impact basin called Valhalla. Concentric rings spreading outward like ripples in a pond after a stone drops. Even in a world of stillness, you can see the memory of a wave. Callisto overview. Isn't that a tender image for the mind? A single moment, one event, one sentence, one loss, can send ripples through years. Some ripples are loud at first, some spread quietly, some return when you least expect them. But ripples are not the same as drowning. Ripples are movement that eventually becomes calm again. If you've been through something that still sends rings through you, it's normal. It's human. Your brain and body are not machines that forget on command. They remember what mattered. They remember what hurt. And sleep is part of how that remembering gets integrated, how it becomes less like a sharp stone in your shoe and more like a story you can carry without bleeding. You might imagine that each crater on Callisto is a memory that has been filed, not erased, but stored. And notice what happens when you stop demanding erasure. Sometimes we suffer not only from our pain, but from the extra layer of believing we shouldn't have it. But Callisto doesn't apologize for its surface. It doesn't try to be smooth to be lovable. It simply exists, cratered and dignified, still part of Jupiter's family, still held in orbit. And you too can be held even with your marks. Now, in a gentle science whisper, Callisto may not be entirely inactive inside. Data from the Galileo spacecraft and later interpretations have suggested Callisto could have a subsurface salty ocean, inferred in part from magnetic signatures consistent with an induced field, similar in concept to Europa's, though the details and confidence levels differ. NASA notes evidence suggesting a subsurface ocean may exist. Callisto overview. So even here on this ancient, cratered, quiet surface, there may be hidden water. Even in a place that looks like nothing is happening, something may be quietly present beneath. Again, the bedtime truth. Stillness can hold depth. You can look fine and still be carrying a whole internal sea. You can be quiet and still be alive. And now, let's turn that into something your nervous system can use tonight. If your emotions have been rising in bed, sadness, worry, emptiness, try meeting them as if you're meeting the hidden ocean under Callisto, not with urgency, with respect. A feeling can be here without needing you to act immediately. A feeling can be here without defining you. A feeling can be here and still be temporary. Now, if you'd like, imagine your mind as Callisto itself, an ancient library. The shelves are tall and dark and quiet. The air smells like dust and paper and time. There are no loud announcements, only the soft sound of pages turning somewhere far down an aisle. A librarian appears, not a person exactly, but a presence, calm, unhurried. And this librarian begins to collect the day. The small moments first, the things you might not even realize you're holding. That message you haven't answered. That tone of voice you can't forget. that tiny embarrassment that keeps tapping at you like a pen. The librarian takes each one and places it in the right section. Not good and bad, just stored. Then the librarian moves to bigger things, the things with weight, the fear you didn't speak, the sadness you hid, the effort you spent trying to be okay. And the librarian does something kind. It doesn't put those heavy books on the top shelf where you'd have to strain to reach them. It places them somewhere stable, somewhere you can find them later if you need, but not somewhere they'll fall on you in the dark. This is what sleep can feel like when it's working well. Not a blankness, but a quiet sorting. And if you're not asleep yet, that doesn't mean it isn't working. Even lying here, letting your body be still, is part of the cueing process. You are telling your brain, we are entering the library, we are dimming the lights. We are giving permission. Now, one more gentle scientific comfort, offered like a blanket. Deep sleep is associated with physical restoration and brain housekeeping. One influential line of research suggests that during sleep, the brain's waste clearance system, sometimes called the glymphatic system, may be more active, helping clear metabolic byproducts. The specifics are still an active area of research, but the general idea is soothing. Sleep is when the brain takes out the trash. Et al., 2013. So if you felt foggy, heavy, or mentally cluttered, consider that your brain has a mechanism for clearing. It doesn't need you to scrub your thoughts clean. It needs you to rest. And Callisto, ancient, cratered, unbothered, becomes the perfect place to practice that kind of rest. A place where time is not a threat. A place where nothing is demanded. A place where the day's impacts can be recorded without being relived. As we begin to drift away from Callisto, you can take one last look. See the craters like soft stamps of time. See the rings like frozen ripples. See the dark plains like quiet margins around the text. And then, let the image fade the way a thought fades when you stop feeding it. You don't have to push it away. Just stop holding it so tightly. Because ahead, the story is preparing its final lullaby, the way Jupiter's moons move together in rhythm. How resonance becomes a kind of cosmic music. A gentle pattern. A repetition you don't have to manage. And as we move toward that last chapter, let Callisto leave you with this. You are not required to be new to be worthy of sleep. You are not required to be unmarked to be safe. You are allowed to be a living archive, held, cratered, real. Now, let the librarians work. Let the shelves fill. Let the lights dim. And let your mind begin to float toward the slow, shared song of orbits, toward the rhythm that will carry you the rest of the way into night. Now we come to the gentlest kind of science. Not fire, not hidden oceans, not craters that remember. Rhythm. The sort of rhythm you don't have to create with effort, because it already exists patiently in the way the universe moves. We drift away from Callisto's ancient library and back into the wider view, where Jupiter is once again the quiet center, massive, steady, unhurried. The planet hangs there like a dark lantern, and around it the moons continue their looping paths, repeating the same curves so faithfully they begin to feel like breath, in and out. If you've been holding yourself tightly, physically, emotionally, mentally, let this be the part of the story where you loosen without thinking too hard about it. Because rhythm is the nervous system's favorite language. It doesn't require persuasion. It doesn't require positive thinking. It doesn't require you to solve the day. It just offers a pattern. And patterns are how the body learns safety. So imagine 3 moons, Io, Europa, and Ganymede, circling Jupiter, not randomly, not chaotically, but in a relationship as elegant as music. They are linked in what's called the Laplace resonance. For every 4 orbits Io completes, Europa completes 2, and Ganymede completes 1. An interlocking 12/4 rhythm that keeps their spacing stable over time, not because they made an agreement, but because gravity, over long ages, shaped their motions into a repeating harmony. Sept Moon Pages, JPL Educational Materials on Laplace Resonance. It's like 3 notes that keep returning to the same chord. You can't hear it with ears, but you can feel it with imagination. Io, swiftest, closest, bright with internal heat. Europa, quieter, wrapped in ice, holding a hidden sea. Ganymede, larger, steady, with its own invisible compass. 3 different worlds. And yet, they keep time together, not perfectly synced like marching drums, more like a lullaby with repeating phrases, where each note arrives when it is supposed to, and the predictability becomes soothing. This is one of the most restful ideas in astronomy, that repetition can be stable, not stuck. That returning doesn't have to mean you're trapped. It can mean you are held in a pattern that keeps you from drifting too far, too fast, too alone. And if your mind tends to loop, replaying worries, rehearsing conversations, circling regret, there's a tender reframe here. A loop isn't always a prison. Sometimes it's your brain trying to find resonance, trying to align, trying to settle into a rhythm that makes the world feel less jagged. The problem isn't that your mind repeats. The problem is when the rhythm is sharp, when the loop is driven by fear, urgency, self-judgment. So tonight, we offer it a different rhythm. A slower one. A kinder one. Let's watch the moons for a moment, as if we're hovering far enough away to see their paths at once. Io moves quickly, close to Jupiter, completing its orbit in less than 2 Earth days. Europa follows, slower. Ganymede slower still. Their speeds differ, but their relationship remains 1, 2, 4, a quiet count that the universe keeps without a clock. Sep, Io, Europa, Ganymede. And because that resonance maintains Europa's and Io's slightly non-circular orbits, tidal forces stay active. The kneading continues. Io stays hot. Europa's interior stays warm enough to keep water from freezing solid beneath its ice. The rhythm does more than create beauty. It creates conditions. It shapes reality. There's something deeply comforting about that. A rhythm that isn't only pretty, a rhythm that helps life's ingredients persist. Now bring that back to your own body. Your body is also a system of rhythms. The heartbeat, steady, repeating, ancient. The breath, rising and falling. The slow cycles of sleep and waking, circadian rhythms that tilt you toward night when the light fades. Circadian overview. Even your brain has rhythms, patterns of electrical activity that change as you relax, drift, and sleep. Again, we don't need to name them like a lecture. Just remember, the brain is not static. It moves in waves. Sleep overview, general neuroscience background. And like Jupiter's moons, your internal rhythms don't always align easily. Stress can throw them off. Screens late at night can confuse the body's sense of darkness. Worry can speed the pulse. Grief can make time feel strange. It's normal. So tonight isn't about forcing alignment. It's about inviting it. Because sleep is not falling off a cliff. Sleep is more like slipping into resonance. A slow matching. A gradual agreement between your nervous system and the night. This is where the idea of entrainment enters, softly, like a candle being covered with a glass so the flame steadies. Entrainment is what happens when one rhythm influences another, until they begin to synchronize, like two pendulums on the same wall gradually swinging together, or like your footsteps unconsciously matching the tempo of music. In humans, our physiology can entrain to steady cues, a slow voice, gentle repetitive sounds, paced breathing. The nervous system is responsive to timing. Predictable timing can be soothing because it reduces uncertainty. Et al., 2015, General Entrainment Literature. You felt this without calling it science. You've rocked a child. You've swayed to music. You've breathed more slowly when someone you trust spoke gently. Rhythm tells the body, you can stop scanning. So let's use that tonight. As you listen, imagining Jupiter's moons, feeling the cadence of words, allow your breathing to find a slow, easy pace. Not forced, not counted like homework, just slightly longer exhales, if that feels good. In and out. If you want an image to hold, imagine Io, Europa, and Ganymede as three lanterns moving on circular rails in the dark, each passing the same point again and again. When Io passes, you inhale. When Europa passes, you exhale. When Ganymede passes, you pause, just a soft resting moment at the bottom of the breath, where nothing is required. In, out, rest. You don't have to keep this perfectly. It's not a test. The point is simply to give your mind something rhythmic enough to lean on. Because the mind, when anxious, tries to grip the future. Rhythm is a way of giving it a handle that isn't sharp. Now, consider the way resonance works as a story about relationships. Io tugs a little on Europa. Europa tugs a little on Ganymede. They keep each other from falling into a simpler, quieter pattern. They maintain each other's eccentricity, the slight ovalness of the orbit that keeps tidal heating alive. Sep moon pages, resonance descriptions. This is a tender truth for people too. We shape one another's rhythms, the people you live with, the people you love, the people who stress you. A harsh environment can entrain you into vigilance, your body learning to stay tight because tightness matches the rhythm around you. A gentle environment can entrain you into ease, your body learning it can soften because softness matches what it senses. And tonight, even if your external environment has been loud or demanding, you are building a small, internal environment of gentleness, a private room inside yourself where the rhythm is slower, where the count is steady, where you are allowed to be human. If thoughts still loop, let them loop more slowly. Instead of the mind racing in tight circles, imagine the loops widening, like orbits that expand into calmer space. Thoughts can still exist, but they don't have to press against you. They can circle at a distance. Jupiter holds them. Gravity holds them. And you, the listener, the traveler, do not have to chase them. Somewhere deep in the mind, there may be a belief that if you stop thinking, something will fall apart. But Jupiter's moons keep moving without anyone supervising them. Your heart keeps beating without you managing each beat. Your lungs keep breathing even if you forget about them for a moment. The body knows. The universe knows. And you can let that knowing carry you. If it helps, you can imagine your worries as little moons too. Small objects of thought orbiting a larger center. They can keep moving. You don't have to catch them. You don't have to pull them down into your hands. Let them orbit. Let them be held by something bigger than effort. Now, let's return to the soundless music of the Laplace resonance. Imagine the pattern like a lullaby played on 3 slow instruments. Io is the high note, bright, quick, flickering. Europa is the middle note, cool, steady, shimmering. Ganymede is the low note, deep, grounded, patient. And Jupiter is the bass, the underlying presence that holds the whole chord. The chord repeats, not because it's trapped, because it's stable. The repetition becomes a cradle. And here the story begins to do what bedtime stories are meant to do. It gently narrows your world, not into a cage, into a nest. The universe outside remains vast, but your attention becomes small and soft. Breath, word, silence. You might notice the edges of your thoughts blurring, the way stars blur when your eyes begin to close. That's okay. Let them blur. Let the brain stop working so hard to keep everything in focus. Sleep is not a failure of focus. It's a change of state, a shift into a different kind of intelligence, one that repairs, integrates, and recalibrates. And if you're still awake, you can stay with rhythm. You can listen to the steady count. 4, 2, 1, 4 of Io, 2 of Europa, 1 of Ganymede. Over and over, like beads sliding on a string. Now notice how your body responds to predictable counting. For many people, predictability is soothing because it reduces the brain's need to predict. When the rhythm is known, the nervous system can stop spending energy scanning for surprise. It can lower its guard without feeling reckless. Et al., 2015, General Predictive Processing Concepts, presented here as a gentle interpretation. This doesn't mean your problems disappear. It means you're allowed to pause them. And in that pause, the brain's natural systems can do their nighttime work. If you like, imagine that as you drift towards sleep, your internal rhythms begin to align. The breath slows. The heart softens. The muscles release. The mind's watchtower dims its lights. Not all at once, gradually. Like moons finding resonance over time. Because resonance isn't forced, it emerges. And sleep, in a way, also emerges. You don't do sleep. You allow sleep. You create the conditions, and then the body takes over. So let the conditions be gentle. Let the rhythm be steady. Let the story be a rocking motion. In and out. And as we come to the end of this chapter, we begin to widen the view one last time. Jupiter holds its moons, and the moons hold their patterns. The Laplace resonance continues, patient and unbothered, like a lullaby that never ends. And you, small, warm, human, are allowed to take your place inside a pattern too. Not a rigid schedule that punishes you, a living rhythm that supports you. Night after night, you return to bed. Breath after breath, you return to the present. You don't have to be perfect. You only have to return. And as you return, the nervous system learns. This is where we rest. This is where we soften. This is where we let go. So let go now, just a little more. Let thoughts widen into quiet orbits. Let your attention settle into the repeating chord of the moons. And let sleep arrive the way resonance arrives, not suddenly, but inevitably, as alignment, as relief, as the deep intelligence of letting yourself be carried. And now, you can let the journey dissolve the way a dream dissolves, without needing to remember every detail. Jupiter can keep turning out there in the dark, wearing its cloud bands like long, slow breathing. The moons can keep circling, each in its own way. Io with its faraway fires, Europa with its hidden ocean, Ganymede with its quiet compass, Callisto with its ancient, unhurried memory. None of them asking you to do anything about them. None of them needing you to be sharp. Somewhere deep in the mind, the part of you that's been watching the door all day can finally sit down. It's normal to feel like you've been bracing, jaw tight, shoulders lifted, thoughts scanning ahead like headlights on a long road. But you don't have to drive anymore tonight. you can pull over into the wide, dark rest area of the universe, where the only sound is time moving gently forward. If your thoughts still flicker, let them. If feelings rise like tides, let them. You are not failing at sleep, you are simply human, with a brain that loves you enough to stay alert until it believes you are safe. So offer it safety the simplest way, with softness, with a slower breath, with a quieter face, with permission. And as you drift, you can imagine your worries becoming small moons too, no longer crashing into you, only circling at a distance, held by something larger than your effort. Like the stars waiting quietly, your body already knows what to do next. Rest now. Let the night do its gentle work.